The tea had gone cold an hour ago, but Amara Whitfield kept both hands wrapped around the cup anyway, because it was the only warm thing she'd touched all morning. 27 years old. Sitting in a wheelchair with a cracked frame and a left wheel that dragged, wearing a cream cardigan worn thin at the cuffs. 2 men in black polo shirts stood over her corner booth at Odette's diner. Plastic badges clipped to their belts that looked official if you didn't read them. One of them was laughing and pointing at her face. The other had his hand on the push handle of her chair like he owned it. Same routine every week, the laughing one said. Roll in, take a table, nurse 1 cup of tea, wait for somebody to feel sorry for you. Amara didn't look away from him. I paid for my tea. I'm a customer. You're a problem. And next week you won't have an address to be a customer from. She tried to turn her chair. He put his shoe against the wheel, and when she raised her voice and told him to take his hand off her chair, the second man's palm came down over her mouth. Easy now, he said. Who's gonna stop us in here? Nobody moved. The manager backed into the kitchen. The waitress stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. A whole room full of people, and not one of them looked up. Then the bell over the door rang. A man in a charcoal wool coat walked in, sat down at the counter, and ordered black coffee without looking at anyone. 34 years old, no tie. His watch turned face in against his wrist. Every man working in that diner knew his name, and every one of them knew better than to say it out loud. He took 1 sip, set the cup down, and turned around on the stool. Take your hand off her. What those 2 men didn't know was who they'd just answered to. And what nobody in that diner could have guessed was that the woman in the broken wheelchair and the man in the charcoal coat had already crossed paths once before, 3 winters earlier, on a night neither of them walked away from unchanged. If a story about dignity, courage, and the price of doing the right thing means something to you, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that diner, to a cup of cold tea and a man who never raises his voice, and find out what happened next. Enzo didn't hurry to rise. He remained seated on the high stool at the counter, one hand resting loosely beside the still steaming cup of coffee, and when he continued, his voice was no louder than it had been when he ordered his drink. What's your name? The man covering Amara's mouth hesitated. He stared blankly at his companion, then looked back at the man at the counter, unable to understand why such an ordinary question had made his hand leave her face of its own accord. Voss, he answered, his voice still carrying the swagger of a man who hadn't yet had time to become afraid. Denny Voss. Enzo gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The words on your shirt. Read them to me. The other man, the one who had laughed and pointed a finger in Amara's face, wasn't laughing anymore. He glanced down at the front of his shirt as though he had forgotten what he was wearing. Hale Real Estate Services, he said. Good. Now, who signed the security contract for that company? The entire diner fell so silent that everyone could hear the espresso machine hissing in the kitchen. It was the third question that brought everything crashing down. Cal Renner, the man standing closer to the door, suddenly took a careful look at the face of the man in the wool coat, and Amara saw the precise moment when the blood drained from his face. He said nothing. He merely reached back, seized his companion by the elbow, and pulled. Let's go, Cal said, so softly that his lips barely seemed to move. Right now. Denny jerked his arm free. Who the hell is he too? I said go. Something in Cal's voice stopped the other man from asking again. The 2 of them walked past the counter, and Enzo didn't turn his head, didn't stand, didn't lift a finger. He only spoke to the counter in front of him, in the same tone a man might use to ask the time. One last question. That chair she's sitting in, do either of you intend to touch it again? Cal shook his head 3 times in quick, clumsy succession. The bell over the door rang again, this time as they left. No one had been touched. Not a single hand had been broken. Not a single table had been shoved aside. Yet when the door closed behind them, everyone inside Odette's exhaled at once, and Amara realized that her hands were trembling, not when the man had covered her mouth, but now, at the very moment it was all over. The manager poked his head out of the kitchen, saw the 2 empty chairs, then withdrew again. The waitress set down the coffee pot, and it made a small clattering sound, because her hand still wasn't steady. Enzo picked up the napkin from the counter, rose, and walked to Amara's table. He didn't lean too close, didn't place a hand on her shoulder, didn't ask whether she was all right. He simply held out the napkin, kept it there, and waited. Amara looked at the spotless white cloth in his hand, then wiped her face with the sleeve of her wool sweater. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was calmer than he had expected. He nodded, drew his hand back, and showed no sign of offense. She opened her small purse, counted several coins with her fingertips, arranged them in a neat little stack beside her tea, which had gone completely cold, then placed her palms on the rims of her wheels. The left wheel caught as it always did, forcing her to lean her entire body to the right to propel herself forward, and in that way she maneuvered between the 2 rows of tables, past the people who only moments earlier had lowered their faces toward their plates. No one said anything to her. No one opened the door for her. She did it herself, with her elbow and her shoulder, as though she had been doing it for nearly 3 winters. Enzo stood motionless and watched until her figure disappeared beyond the glass, clouded with steam. He wasn't thinking about the 2 men who had just left. He was thinking about something else. Something so small that perhaps he alone in the entire diner had noticed it. When that hand had closed over her mouth, she hadn't scratched, hadn't struggled, hadn't struck out. She had pressed 2 fingers of her right hand against the inside of her own left wrist and held them there. He had seen people make that gesture before, but not in places like this, and not by people who were afraid. He was still thinking about it when his eyes caught a slender glint beneath the table where the wheelchair had been. He bent down and picked it up. He turned it over in his palm exactly once, then closed his fingers around it and slipped it into the left breast pocket of his coat. He paid for the coffee he hadn't finished, left a tip several times the amount of the bill, and stepped out into the cold without saying another word to anyone. That morning had begun long before the bell over the door at Odette's rang for the first time. It was still dark, and Amara was already awake, lying there listening to the pipes groan inside the walls as they did every cold season. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building without an elevator, and over all the time she had lived there, she had learned to arrange her entire life so that it fit within the distance between her bed and the front door. Kiana got up first and moved quietly around the kitchen because she thought her sister was still asleep. She made coffee for both of them, drank hers standing beside the sink, then left the rest in the pot for Amara, and each time, Amara pretended to sleep for a few more minutes so her younger sister could leave without worrying. "I'm heading in for the early shift," Kiana called from the other room, making her voice sound deliberately light. "I'll stop by your place around noon." Amara answered that she was fine, told her not to skip a meal, and listened to the lock turn, to Kiana's footsteps descending the stairs, and then to the silence. In that silence, she sat up, braced both hands against the edge of the bed, transferred herself into the wheelchair with a motion that had long since become instinct, and remained still for a moment, waiting for the ache in her hip to subside. On the dining table, amid several bills arranged in neat stacks, lay the paper with a seal stamped in the upper corner. She didn't need to read it again. She had read it often enough to know every line by heart, and the only thing she could still see clearly was the number of days remaining. 9 days. She turned the paper face down, as though doing so might make it a little less real, then wheeled herself toward the door. The ramp outside the building hadn't been built by the landlord. Several neighbors had pooled their lumber and built it themselves one Saturday afternoon, using uneven boards and nails of different lengths, but it was sturdy, and after all these winters, it still hadn't begun to loosen. Amara crossed it every day, and every day she remembered who had held the hammer. When she reached the sidewalk, she pulled the collar of her sweater a little higher and began pushing herself toward the corner. The left wheel still caught, so every few turns she had to correct her direction, and she did it without even thinking anymore, the way people don't think about the fact that they're breathing. It was Tuesday. She went to Odette's on Tuesdays, and the reason was so simple that she had never told anyone. Years ago, whenever she passed an exam, her mother would take her to that diner and order her a cup of hot tea. Not cake, not ice cream, just a cup of tea, because she said people celebrated with whatever they could afford, and there was no shame in what they could afford. Delphine Whitfield would sit across from her daughter at that very corner table beside the window, her chin resting in both hands, listening as the girl described the hardest questions on the test, and smiling as though she had never heard anything more wonderful. She had sat there on the day Amara passed the final examination for her professional license, and she had sat there for the last time on a morning when both mother and daughter knew it would be the last, though neither of them said it aloud. Now her mother was gone, but the table remained, so Amara still came every Tuesday, ordered a cup of tea, and sat in that same place. That morning, just after her tea arrived, She took her phone from her coat pocket to check the time. The screen lit up, and in the upper corner appeared the small symbol she had seen hundreds of times before. An unheard voicemail sent the previous summer. She knew who had left it. She knew how long it was because she had looked at that number so many times that she had memorized it, though she had never once pressed play. There had been evenings when she brought her finger close to it, and evenings when she told herself that she would listen when things became a little better, when she felt a little steadier, when she no longer saw herself as quite so pitiful. Her finger stopped there, less than the width of a knuckle from the screen, and remained there longer than she had intended. Then she turned off the phone, placed it face down on the table, and reached for the cup of tea that was still sending up curls of steam. The warehouse by the harbor was colder near noon than it was outside, and the smell of machine oil had clung to the walls for so long that nothing could wash it away. Enzo Castellani sat at the head of a long table positioned between the storage racks. His wool coat draped over the back of his chair, with 3 files in front of him that Nadia Ferraro had already arranged in the order she wanted him to read them. Nadia wasn't the kind of person who softened anything with words. She placed one finger on the middle file and told him plainly that if he wanted to move 2 transportation companies onto the clean side of the books that quarter, he would have to accept a loss his father would never have tolerated. "You know what the old men will say?" she said. "They'll say you're cutting off your own hand." Enzo turned a page without looking up. "They've been saying that since spring. This time is different. This time, real money is coming out of their pockets." He closed the file and pushed it toward her, then let it come out. "I don't want to be here 3 years from now, still having to remember the name of every person I need to call before I can sign an ordinary contract." Nadia studied him for a moment with the gaze of someone who had served 3 generations of this family and had learned that arguing with him was useless, but she still added one final warning. His father had built this with things that never appeared in the books, she told him, and some people in the family saw what Enzo was doing as a betrayal, not a reform. Enzo didn't answer. He rose, put on his coat, and told her to take him through the southern neighborhood before dark. There, inside a small cafe whose glass windows were covered with flyers, a man sat at the table farthest in the back, with a ledger and a cloth bag, and the elderly people in the neighborhood still had to come there at the beginning of every month to make payments on debts they would never be able to repay. Enzo pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't make a threat. He simply looked at the open ledger, then raised his eyes. "You have 2 ways out," he said, "and I'm only going to tell you about the first." Then he told him. It took less than 2 minutes. The other man didn't ask what the second way was. The following morning, the table in the back of that cafe was empty, and no one in the neighborhood ever saw him again. On the way back to the harbor, Nadia sat in the rear seat, opened her tablet, and began reading him the schedule for the coming week. The meetings, the signatures, a dinner with the Harbor Trade Council that he had already postponed twice. He listened, nodded, and answered each item with a few concise words. Then she noticed that he was no longer listening. He was gazing through the window toward the intersection, where the awnings of the old neighborhood still bore several hand-painted signs, and his right hand had risen to the left breast pocket of his coat. He took out something small, held it in his palm, and lowered his head to look at it. Nadia couldn't see clearly what it was. She only saw it catch the light once when he turned it, and she watched his fingers close around it very slowly, more slowly than he did anything else. He held it in his palm that way for a long stretch of the drive, then returned it to his pocket and smoothed the fabric over it with his thumb. "Is something wrong?" Nadia asked. "No," he said. She had worked beside him long enough to know that when he answered that quickly, it meant something was. She turned back to her tablet and didn't ask again. But throughout that afternoon, she couldn't stop thinking about his face as he had lowered his eyes to that small object, because over all those years, she had seen Enzo Castellani sit across from men who wanted him dead, had seen him receive terrible news without changing his expression, had seen him sign papers that cost other people everything they owned, and not once had she ever seen him look at anything for so long. Word of what had happened at Odette's reached Bruno Tedesco before nightfall, and that evening he was already seated in the private dining room at the back of the restaurant on Wharton Street, his arms folded across his chest, waiting for Enzo to walk in. Bruno had occupied that chair since Enzo's father was alive, and he had a habit of speaking as though the chair gave him the right to say anything he pleased. "You sat at the counter in a diner," Bruno began, without even waiting for him to remove his coat. And you let everyone in that place see your face because of two young punks working for a real estate company. Enzo pulled out a chair, sat down, and poured himself a glass of water. They put a hand over the mouth of a woman in a wheelchair. So what? Bruno leaned forward. That's the company's business. Their neighborhood, their papers, their trouble. Do you know who that company is doing business with? Do you know what you just stepped into the middle of? I know, Enzo said. No, you don't. You think you know. Bruno tapped his forefinger against the tabletop, one measured beat at a time. This family doesn't involve itself in other people's affairs without a reason. You stepped in for someone you don't know, in a place where you have nothing to protect, in front of an entire diner filled with people who have eyes and phones. Enzo set down his glass. This family has a code, he said. My grandmother left it to us. We don't touch the elderly. We don't touch women. And we don't touch anyone who can't rise on their own. I didn't involve myself in anyone else's business. I simply stood where that code told me to stand. Bruno laughed, a dry sound like a cough. He leaned back in his chair and looked Enzo up and down with the gaze of a man who had carried him in his arms when the boy hadn't yet reached his waist. Do you know when the old woman made that rule? Bruno asked. Enzo didn't answer. She made it after she buried 2 of her children. 2 of them, in the same year. She sat in that kitchen with dirt still clinging to her hands, and she spoke that rule because she had nothing else left to say. He pointed a finger at Enzo's chest, not forcefully, but hard enough to touch him. You haven't buried anyone, Enzo. You haven't lost anything. You haven't earned the right to use that rule. No one in the room said another word. The server standing at the kitchen door saw what was happening, stepped back, and closed it. Enzo didn't strike the table, didn't raise his voice, and didn't look away. He held Bruno's gaze for another moment, then rose, put on his coat, and said he would see him again at the end of the week to discuss the northern shipping route. That was all he said. Nadia was already waiting in the hallway with her coat draped over one arm, and she had heard enough to know she shouldn't ask. Enzo walked several paces ahead of her, then stopped in the middle of the hall. Find the woman from this morning, he said. Nadia released a long breath. You just heard what he said. I heard him. Then you can hear this too. She stepped forward until she was beside him. I'm not afraid of Bruno, but I know how to count. You're cleaning up the books. You're costing 4 or 5 men who sit at the same table with you real money. And now you want me to dig through the records of a stranger you saw in a diner. Give me one reason, and I'll do it. Enzo was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was even lower than it had been with Bruno. When that hand covered her face, she didn't struggle, didn't scratch, didn't strike. She placed 2 fingers against her own wrist and held them there. Nadia frowned. What does that mean? It means she was taking her own pulse. Ordinary people don't do that. They only do it if they've been taught to do it, and that is taught in one very specific kind of place. He opened the door to the cold outside. Look in the medical field. Throughout the drive home that night, he didn't think about the books, nor did he think about the northern shipping route. He kept hearing a single sentence over and over in his mind, the sentence Bruno had spoken with the certainty of a man who believed he had the right to say it. You haven't buried anyone. You haven't earned the right. It began on Thursday morning, when Amara wheeled herself to the top of the ramp and found a yellow notice pasted to the uppermost board. She had to lean forward to read the small print near the bottom. The notice called the ramp an unpermitted structure, stated that it encroached on the required setback, and gave the landlord a short period of time to remove it before the city removed it for him and charged him for the labor. She sat there for quite a while, her hands still resting on the wheel rims, looking at the uneven boards her neighbors had nailed together for her one Saturday afternoon. Verna Otley, who lived in the last apartment in the row, came out with her cane, read the notice, then spoke in the raspy voice of a woman who had lived in that neighborhood longer than everyone else there combined. This ramp has stood here through more winters than I can count. Now it's suddenly in the way, child? That afternoon, the service company that regularly hired Amara to transcribe recordings of medical records at night sent her a short letter. It said that because of client feedback concerning quality and confidentiality, they were temporarily suspending her assignments until further notice. She had worked for them for nearly 3 winters, typing in the darkness with headphones over her ears and her hands on the keyboard, and in all that time, there hadn't been a single complaint. She called the number printed on the letter, and the woman on the other end said the decision had come from above, that she was only responsible for sending the letter, and that she was very sorry. Amara thanked her, and ended the call because she knew exactly what it felt like to have to deliver a decision she hadn't made. Kiana came home later than usual that night. She stood in the doorway without removing her coat, and Amara knew immediately that something was wrong. "Someone came to my work," Kiana said. "Two men. They were dressed well. They weren't customers. They asked my manager whether I lived in Crescent Row, who I lived with, and whether I was the person whose name was on the lease." Amara kept her voice calm. "Then what happened?" "My manager told me to come out and speak with them. They gave me a business card and said that if you and I needed advice about our relocation rights, we should call them." The girl placed the card on the table, and her hand trembled. "How did they know where I work?" Amara had no answer for her sister that night, but the answer was already waiting inside a thick file on the top floor of a building across the river, where Preston Hale sat before an enlarged map of Crescent Row pinned to the wall. Nearly every square on that map had been completely filled in with a blue marker. The entire row had signed, one household at a time. Some had signed because they were tired, some because they were afraid, and some because they had been handed a check during the hardest month of their lives. Only one square remained unmarked, and beside it was a handwritten name. Hale's problem wasn't one small apartment on the second floor of an old building. His problem was the neighborhood charter, which stipulated that if every resident consented, the land could be rezoned through a private agreement without going to public auction and without giving other investors the chance to see the true figures. With even one signature missing, that door would swing open, and everything he had invested over more than 2 years would be laid out on the table for others to bid on. The man handling the file explained that the quickest approach was to apply administrative pressure, and that people in such circumstances usually signed after the second or third round. Hale listened, nodded, and asked only one question. What kind of person was the remaining name? The man opened the file, skimmed it, then said she was a woman in a wheelchair who lived with her younger sister, had no steady employment, no lawyer, and no influential relatives. Hale tapped the tip of his pen against the desk twice and said that in that case, this should have been finished the month before. Early Saturday morning, the lights were already on in the activity room at the Crescent Row Community Center, and Amara had arrived before everyone else, arranging the CPR training mannequins in a row on the floor and repositioning the space heater so that it blew toward the door. There weren't many people who came to learn, and there never had been. There was Verna, an afternoon shift plumber, 2 women who worked at the grocery store on the corner, and a silver-haired man who had never given his name but came every week. They sat in a semicircle on folding plastic chairs, while Amara remained in her wheelchair at the center, her hands resting on her knees, showing each person where to place the heel of the hand, how to lock the elbows, and how to count the rhythm. She made them practice again and again until their arms ached, and she didn't let anyone stop early. On the wall behind her, between several notices for neighborhood meetings and an old calendar, hung a large sheet of paper ruled by hand. It listed every apartment in the neighborhood where someone had difficulty moving around, along with the apartment number, the floor, and the name of the person who lived with them. Amara had created it during the first season she taught the class, and every few months she took out a pen and corrected a line whenever someone moved away or someone grew weaker. That day, as the class was nearly ending, the plumber rubbed his wrist and asked her a question that many people in the room had probably wanted to ask for a long time. "Amara, let me ask you honestly. You don't charge a penny to teach this. Why do you do it?" She was silent longer than anyone expected. Then she told them, 3 winters earlier, on a rainy night, she was driving home after her shift and passed through the intersection beneath the overpass, where water always gathered in a broad pool whenever the rain came down. A sedan lay on its side beside the road, its taillights still blinking through the rain, while other cars kept passing, slowing for a moment before continuing on. She counted 11 of them before she pulled over. Inside the car was a young woman who was still conscious, still able to speak, with a wound in her thigh that Amara knew at once couldn't wait. She crawled inside through the rear door, pressed both hands against the wound, and held them there. She kept talking so the young woman wouldn't close her eyes, asking her name, asking where she lived, asking whether someone was waiting for her at home, and every few seconds reminding her that she was still there with her. Amara remembered reading a string of numbers to someone over the phone, speaking slowly and repeating them twice to be certain. She remembered the sound of the ambulance siren echoing from very far away, and she remembered the sound of tires sliding across the wet pavement behind her, that long, slick sound she could still hear whenever it rained and someone braked suddenly in the street. The entire room fell silent. Verna raised a hand to her mouth. Amara continued in a calm voice, as though she were repeating a lesson she had taught many times before. People often ask whether I regret it, she said. I lost the use of my legs. She lived. That isn't a trade. It's an equation, and I still arrive at the same answer. Then she gently tapped the shoulder of the training mannequin beside her. In this city, an ambulance arrives quickly on a good day, but on a bad day, it doesn't. Yet the first 4 minutes always belong to the person who is standing there. They don't belong to the finest doctor. They belong to the person who is standing there. I teach this for free because when something happens in our neighborhood, I want the person standing there to know what to do during those 4 minutes. No one said anything more. The silver-haired man lowered his eyes to his hands. In the last row of chairs near the door, Tessa Dolan had been sitting quietly since the beginning of the class, and in her palm was a phone that was still on, its screen turned down toward her thigh, the recording light still glowing. She hadn't told anyone she was filming, not even Amara. She only thought that some words shouldn't be allowed to fall into the air and disappear, and that perhaps one day, someone would need to hear those exact words again. Nadia Ferraro spent nearly an entire week on what she still called the boss's little matter, in the privacy of her own mind. She began where Enzo had directed her, in the medical field, and she began by eliminating possibilities. There was no one named Amara Whitfield on the current staff roster of any hospital in the city, but in the database of expired professional licenses, the name appeared on her second search, along with the facility where the woman had once worked, the emergency department at Mercy East Hospital, and a dry notation stating that the license hadn't been renewed for personal reasons. Nadia printed the page, set it aside, and began working backward. She searched for the reason an emergency room nurse had stopped practicing in the middle of the finest years of her life, and she searched in the place where people always left a trail, traffic accident records. It took another 2 days because the name she was looking for didn't appear in the report. The person listed on the second victim line was recorded as A. Whitford. 1 letter. Only 1 letter was wrong, but it was enough to let that name slip beyond the reach of every database anyone might search by entering the correct spelling. Nadia sat before the screen for a long time when she realized this, because in all her years of doing this work, she had learned that typographical errors in official records were rarely just typographical errors. She continued reading. The date on the report was a day near the end of October, 3 winters earlier. The location was the intersection beneath the western overpass. The third vehicle involved was a medium-duty box truck, and in the registration section, the license plate and the commercial transportation permit number of the company that owned it had been recorded. The driver wasn't listed in the report. The space for the driver's statement was blank. The final determination contained one brief sentence stating that the case had been closed because there wasn't sufficient evidence to reach a conclusion. Nadia called a man she knew at the transportation department, someone who had owed her a favor for a very long time, and read him the permit number. He told her to wait. When he called back, there was a hesitation in his voice, the kind that came over a man who had just read something he didn't want to be involved in. The permit belonged to a small transportation company registered to haul freight within the city. It had declared only a few vehicles, and its office was listed at an address that was now a laundromat. The company had ceased operations the following spring. Nadia asked whose name was on the registration. The man on the other end read the name aloud, and Nadia told him to read it again. She wrote it on a piece of paper by hand, slowly, 1 letter at a time, then sat staring at it. Preston Hale. She knew that name. Everyone who did business in the southern neighborhood knew that name. It appeared on the large construction sign standing at the entrance to Crescent Row. It appeared at the bottom of the letters sent to every household in the neighborhood. And that name was, quite literally, printed across the shirts of the 2 men who had stood in front of the table of a woman in a wheelchair at Odette's on Tuesday morning. Nadia folded the paper in half, opened it again, then folded it once more. She considered calling Enzo immediately, then thought better of it. She had worked for this family long enough to know that some information, once spoken aloud, could never be taken back, and that when that man learned the truth, he would do something whose consequences neither of them could yet foresee. She also thought of the woman from the diner, who was still living in that neighborhood, still opening letters bearing the same name each month, and still had no idea that the name on those envelopes and the name in the report from that night belonged to the same man. Nadia turned off the screen, rose with the paper in her hand, and went to find her coat. Nadia didn't tell Enzo about the name on the paper that day. She told him about the second-floor apartment, the yellow notice pasted to the wooden ramp, the transcription contract that had been terminated, and the people who had gone all the way to the younger sister's workplace. When she finished, she placed a thick envelope on the table and told him that if he wanted to resolve this matter cleanly, this was the cleanest way to do it. Enzo looked at the envelope for a long time, then told her to bring it with them. The following afternoon, the black car stopped at the entrance to Crescent Row, and Enzo walked the rest of the way. He arrived just as Amara was returning from the community center, carrying a paper bag filled with photocopied materials for the following week's class. She recognized him immediately, though he hadn't said a word. Nadia stepped forward, introduced herself by name and title, then held out the envelope. She explained briefly that it contained compensation for the trouble Amara had endured, that there were no conditions attached, and that she could use it to rent a new place to live, or for anything else she considered necessary. Amara looked at the envelope without reaching for it. She stared at it for so long that Nadia had to lower her hand slightly. "Let me make sure I understand," Amara said. "Is this meant to make me stay quiet, or to make me forget?" Nadia was about to answer, but Amara continued before she could. "If you're trying to pay me to forget Tuesday morning, I'm cheaper than you think. I forget for free. I'm very good at forgetting. I've been practicing for 3 winters." With the back of her hand, she gently pushed the envelope toward Nadia. She didn't slap it away or throw it. She moved it only far enough to remove it from the space between them. "But I won't take the money. Not because I don't need it. I need it desperately. I need it so badly that if you stand here for another 10 minutes, I may change my mind. So, it would be best if you put it away for me." Nadia opened her mouth, then closed it again. In all her years of handing envelopes to people, she had never met anyone who refused one by telling her precisely how close she was to reaching her limit. Nadia folded the envelope and slipped it into her bag. Until then, Enzo had remained one step behind her without interfering. He spoke only after Nadia stepped away. "I didn't come here because of that envelope." "Then why did you come?" "I came to see the ramp." Amara raised one eyebrow slightly, then turned her wheelchair, and the 3 of them went to the entrance of the row. The yellow notice was still there, its edges curled from the night mist. Enzo bent down and read it, all of it, including the small print. He made no comment. When Amara began pushing herself up the ramp, he stepped behind her by instinct, reached out with both hands, and placed them on the handles at the back of her wheelchair. He hadn't begun to push when she spoke. "Take your hands off." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the afternoon air like something very sharp. Enzo withdrew his hands immediately, stepped back half a pace, and held both palms open at his waist. Amara turned her head and looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, something very much like anger appeared in her eyes. "Do you know how many people do exactly what you just did in the course of 1 week?" she said. "They don't ask. They simply put their hands on the chair and push. Store clerks, strangers on the street, once even a police officer. Every one of them thinks they're helping." She drew a breath. "This chair is my legs. You don't put your hands on another person's legs without asking permission." Nadia stood several paces away and held her breath, because she knew very well when someone had last spoken to this man in that tone, and she remembered how it had ended. But Enzo's expression didn't change. He remained still, his hands where Amara could see them, and gave a single nod. "I understand," he said. "I'm sorry." Then he added, more slowly, as though he were committing something to a place in his mind where he wouldn't forget it. "May I help push you?" Amara studied him for a long moment. "No," she replied. "Not today." "All right," he said, and he stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her push herself all the way up the ramp, across every uneven board, until she opened the door and disappeared inside. On the way back to the car, Nadia could no longer restrain herself. "You just let that woman scold you in the middle of the street." "I was just taught something," Enzo said, and from that day forward, whenever he stood behind that wheelchair, he always asked first. Preston Hale owned a restaurant on the top floor of the building across the river, a place where a person seated at a table could look down over the entire southern neighborhood, including Crescent Row, lying flattened among the old rooftops. He ate lunch there almost every day, always at the same table, and the server knew his habits so well that there was no need to ask what he wanted to drink. That day, he was unfolding his napkin across his lap when he saw the restaurant manager approaching, his face pale, and watched him bend down to whisper a sentence into his ear. Hale looked up, Enzo Castellani was already seated in the chair across from him, his wool coat draped over the back of the chair beside him, while a server had just placed a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't ordered. "Chi? I don't recall having an appointment," Hale said. "You don't," Enzo replied. Hale smiled the smile of a man accustomed to sitting at the head of the table. "Then I'm listening. But I have a meeting at 1 o'clock. From the inside pocket of his coat, Enzo took out 3 sheets of paper folded in half and spread them across the table one at a time, turning each one so Hale could read it. The first was a copy of the primary construction contract for the Crescent Row project, specifically the section detailing the site clearance schedule and the binding deadline imposed by the financing party. The second was a short list, 4 lines bearing the names of 4 suppliers on whom Hale's construction site depended for concrete, rebar, transportation, and heavy equipment. The third contained only one handwritten name in the center of an otherwise blank page. Hale glanced at the first sheet, read the second carefully, and when he reached the third, he remained perfectly still for a long time. "What is this?" he asked. "That is the name of the person who introduced you to 2 of the 4 suppliers on that list," Enzo said. "And he works for me." Hale placed one hand on the edge of the table. The smile remained on his face, but at some point, it had vanished from his eyes. "Mr. Castellani, I run a legitimate business. My paperwork is clean. If you have a problem with the service company I hired, you should speak to them." "I already did," Enzo replied. 2 of their men, in a diner. The air around the table seemed to thicken. A server started toward them to refill their water, but the manager caught him by the sleeve and held him back. Enzo looked down at the 3 sheets, then pushed the second one slightly forward, the one containing those 4 lines. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you'll receive 3 phone calls. 3 of the 4 names on this page will tell you they have to postpone their deliveries for technical reasons. Starting tomorrow morning, you'll have 1 left." Hale swallowed. "You're threatening me in my own restaurant." "No." Enzo said it so softly that Hale had to lean closer to hear him. "If I were threatening you, you wouldn't know in advance. I'm giving you notice. My grandmother taught me that decent people give notice, and I still try to hold on to a few of the things she taught me." He rose and draped his coat over his arm. "There's a wooden ramp at the entrance to Crescent Row. It isn't encroaching on anything, and it has been there longer than your permit. I want the notice pasted to it gone before the end of the week." Hale looked up, and for the first time, he asked the question directly. "What is she to you?" Enzo paused beside the table. "Nothing yet," he said. "But keep going, and she will be." He left all 3 sheets on the table without taking back a single one, and walked out. The sound of the elevator doors closing carried all the way into the dining room. Hale sat motionless for a while, his eyes still fixed on the page with the handwritten name in its center. Then he pulled open the small drawer beneath the table, took out an amber bottle, twisted off the cap with 2 fingers, shook out 1 pill, and swallowed it without water. He remained seated for another half-minute with both palms flat against the table, waiting for something inside his chest to ease. Then he returned the bottle to the drawer, closed it, and reached for his phone. The retaliation didn't come from Enzo's direction. It came straight at Amara, and it came within 4 days. First, a stack of legal papers was delivered directly to the door of the second-floor apartment, a civil lawsuit filled with words like defamation, fabrication, and damage to business reputation, along with a demand for compensation so enormous that when Amara finished reading it, she found it more absurd than frightening, because no one could take away what she didn't have. Then came the recording. Nadia called to tell her that the surveillance system at Odette's had been examined, and the maintenance company had concluded that the hard drive had failed. None of the footage from that entire week could be recovered. Then Tessa Dolan was fired, with the letter citing a violation of customer privacy policy, and she called Amara from a bus stop, her voice choking as she said she didn't regret what she had done, but she didn't know how she would pay her rent the following month. Last came the article. A local paper ran a short piece in its city section, placing the name Whitfield beside the name Castellani in the headline, and in that article, the woman in a wheelchair from Crescent Row was portrayed as a pawn in a dispute between developers and forces determined to keep the city from changing. Not one line mentioned the hand that had covered her mouth, but it wasn't the article that drove Amara to seek answers. It was the written statement. Nadia read it to her over the phone, 1 line at a time, a signed declaration from the manager of Odette's, stating that a customer had caused a disturbance that day, that the service company's employees had behaved properly, that no conduct had crossed any boundaries, and that the manager confirmed these facts as a witness to the entire incident. At the bottom of the statement was Walter Kemp's signature. Amara went to the diner during the quietest part of the day, in the middle of the afternoon. Walter was wiping down the counter when she entered, and when he raised his eyes and saw her, his hand stopped midway. The cloth remained where it was, and he didn't continue wiping. "You came because of the paper," he said. "I came to ask you one question." Amara wheeled herself closer to the counter. "You were standing right there. You saw everything. How could you sign it?" Walter Kemp set down the cloth. He was the man who had poured her tea every Tuesday morning through more seasons than she could count. The man who had known her mother. The man who had called her daughter before she ever sat in that wheelchair. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize either. He simply stood there for a long time with both hands braced against the counter, then told her something she was utterly unprepared to hear. "I didn't just sign it, child." Amara looked up. "I called them." The entire diner fell silent. The espresso machine gave a sharp hiss, then went quiet. "Every Tuesday morning when you came in," Walter said, his eyes fixed on the counter. "I dialed a number. I called someone at that company and told them you were here." He swallowed. "The lease on this diner expires at the end of the year. They own the building. They told me that if I let them know whenever you came in, they would extend my lease for another 3 years. I asked what they intended to do. They said they only wanted to speak with you for a few minutes, just a few minutes, so you would agree to sign that paper." He raised his eyes, and they were red. "I didn't know they would do what they did. You have to believe me. I didn't know." Amara said nothing. She looked toward the corner table beside the window, the table where her mother had once sat across from her with her chin resting in both hands. She thought of all those Tuesday mornings, of the cup of tea brought to her before she could order because Walter already knew what she drank, of the way he always left enough space beside the window for her wheelchair to pass. She thought about how, on every one of those mornings, someone had dialed a number behind the counter. "I don't hate you," Walter said, and his voice broke. "You have to understand that. I don't hate you, I'm all alone." Amara still said nothing. She placed both hands on the wheel rims, turned her chair, and pushed toward the door. He called her name once, then again, but she didn't stop, and she didn't look back. The message arrived that evening while Amara was still sitting in the darkness of the second-floor apartment without having turned on the lights. It was brief, with no greeting and no preamble. He wrote that he had something belonging to her, that it had fallen at Odette's on Tuesday morning, that he didn't want to entrust it to anyone else, and he included an address in the old eastern neighborhood. Amara read the message 3 times. She raised a hand to her neck, and only then did she realize. She had gone all those days without wearing it, and hadn't noticed because she had spent those days thinking about too many other things. Her mother's delicate necklace, the only thing left after everything else had been sold, one possession at a time, during those final months in the hospital. She sent back exactly one word: coming. The house stood at the end of a narrow street, 2 stories high, with a faded wooden door and nothing to suggest who its owner was. There was no iron gate, no one standing guard, and no car parked outside. Enzo opened the door with both sleeves rolled to his elbows and a towel draped over one shoulder. He looked down at the step, then at her, and before she could say anything, he asked, "May I push you over this step?" Amara hesitated for a moment, then she nodded. Inside, the kitchen was the only room in the house with its lights on. It was an old kitchen, with square tiles the color of pale ivory, a long wooden table worn smooth at both ends, and something simmering very softly on the stove. Enzo took a small envelope from the pocket of the coat hanging over a chair, opened it, and placed the necklace on the table before her. The chain had been repaired where it had broken, carefully joined by hand so that the repair was neat and secure. Amara picked it up, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. "When did it break?" she asked. "When that hand came down over your mouth," he said. "I found it after you left." "Why didn't you return it the next day?" Enzo turned back to the pot on the stove. "Because the next day, I still didn't know who you were, and because I thought that if I came to your home carrying this, you would think I was trying to pay you in another way." Amara closed her fingers around the necklace. She looked around the kitchen, at the old apron hanging behind the door, at the man stirring the pot with the movements of someone who had done it many times before. "You have an entire city," she said. "Why don't you hire someone to cook?" He didn't turn around. "Because this is the only kitchen where no one is afraid of me." The front door opened. There was the sound of a key, the sound of a purse being set down, then a young woman's voice calling out to ask her brother why he was cooking so much food. Then she entered the kitchen. Juliana Castellani was 25 years old, her hair tied high, a stack of sheet music in her hands. She saw the guest seated at the table and smiled, about to offer a greeting. Amara looked up. "Hello," she said. Only that, the sheet music fell to the floor. Juliana froze in the kitchen doorway, and in an instant, her face turned deathly pale. She gripped the doorframe with one hand. Enzo turned off the stove and stepped toward her. "Julie." She didn't look at him. She stared at Amara with wide eyes, and a tremor began in her shoulders and traveled down into her hands. "Your voice," she said. "I don't remember anyone's face. The doctors told me I would never remember that night. I don't remember a face, but I remember your voice." Amara didn't understand what was happening. She started to say something, then stopped. Enzo placed a hand very gently on his sister's shoulder. "Sit down first." Juliana shook her head. She kept looking at Amara as though she feared the woman seated there would disappear if she so much as blinked. "You kept talking to me," she said, her voice breaking. "You told me I was still there with you. You said it again and again. For 3 winters. I've heard that sentence in my head without knowing whose voice it was." Then she added one more thing, speaking as casually as though it were a small, insignificant detail that had just risen from the depths of her memory. "You were also talking to someone on the phone. I heard you say you could see the license plate and that you were reading the number back." The entire kitchen fell silent. Enzo stood motionless, his hand still resting on his sister's shoulder, and Amara saw clearly that something had just drained every trace of color from his face. Enzo called Nadia that same night, after Amara had gone home and Juliana had fallen asleep, and he told her exactly one thing. There had been a call to the emergency dispatch center that night, and during that call, someone had read out a license plate number. It took Nadia another 3 days. She began with the easiest step, requesting a copy of the recording by the case number, and received a single line in response, stating that the audio file wasn't included in the record. She didn't stop there. She went looking for the archive log, the thing people rarely thought about, the record showing which files had been entered into the system on which dates, and which files had been removed on which dates. The audio file from that night had once existed. It remained in the system for exactly 11 days. Then it was removed under a request for a record correction, the kind of request used when a technical error needed to be fixed, and the requesting party was listed as a small law office Nadia recognized immediately, because that office had served only one client for the past 20 years. She sat before the screen for a long time before clicking the final line, the one bearing the name of the person who had signed the authorization. The scanned signature appeared on the screen, slanting to the right, its final stroke trailing like a tail. Bruno Tedesco. Nadia printed the page, and her hand went cold when she picked it up. She spent the next 2 days searching for the rest, not to prove what had happened, but to understand it. What she found was even harder to swallow than what she had suspected. There had been no payment, no envelope, no unfamiliar account, no recorded gift. That medium-duty truck, the one registered under the permit of the small transportation company owned by Preston Hale, hadn't been carrying Hale's freight that night. It had been carrying freight along the western route, a route that passed through 3 warehouses, all 3 of them belonging to the Castellani family. The driver had exceeded the number of hours legally permitted without anyone recording it, and if the accident had been thoroughly investigated, the inspectors wouldn't have stopped at the truck. They would have traced the shipping route backward, and they would have reached the warehouses. At 4:15 that morning, a call had been placed from the route dispatcher's number directly to Bruno Tedesco's. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Nadia laid all those papers on the long table inside the harbor warehouse on Friday afternoon, when all 4 members of the family council were present, and Bruno was seated in the place he had occupied since Enzo's father was alive. She didn't speak at length. She read the date, the case number, and the name of the law office, and finally placed the page bearing the scanned signature on top, turning it so Enzo could read it. No one in the room said anything. Bruno didn't deny it, nor did he lower his head. He merely braced both hands against the table, and spoke with the certainty of a man who had thought about this moment many times through all those winters. If I had left it alone, they would have entered the warehouses. If they entered the warehouses, the entire western route would have stopped, and then it wouldn't have been one person who suffered a loss. It would have been 40 families. He looked directly at Enzo. You sit there and think I sold someone. I didn't sell anyone. I simply chose the side that would hurt less. You changed a name, Enzo said. It was the first sentence he had spoken since entering the room. I changed one letter, Bruno replied. One letter, Enzo. People misspell one another's names every day. That one letter kept her from finding her own records for 3 winters. Enzo picked up the page. He didn't look at it again. He folded it in half, then into quarters, very slowly, while everyone at the table watched his hands. Nadia stood at the head of the table, and without realizing it, she took half a step back. Enzo slipped the paper into the left breast pocket of his coat, the same place where he had carried a broken necklace several weeks earlier, then smoothed the fabric over it with his thumb. After that, he rose. He didn't strike the table. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at the man who had occupied that chair since Enzo hadn't yet been tall enough to see over the tabletop, and he spoke in the tone someone might use to ask the time. You carried me in your arms when I was 5 years old. He paused for a moment. So today, I'm allowing you to walk out on your own feet. Bruno remained seated. It took him several seconds longer than everyone else in the room to understand what those words meant, and when he did, his face turned gray. He pushed back his chair, rose, and walked out on his own feet between 2 rows of people, not one of whom stood to see him off. He came the following evening, alone, without Nadia, and without a car parked at the entrance to the row. Amara opened the door and found him standing there in the familiar wool coat, both hands visible outside his pockets. And she knew immediately that something was wrong because until then, he had never arrived without warning her first. She let him in. Kiana was working the night shift, and only one table lamp was lit in the apartment. Enzo sat in the chair across from Amara and placed a thin stack of papers on the table. He didn't begin with a preamble. He told her everything plainly, from beginning to end, concealing nothing, not even the parts anyone else would have hidden. He told her about the name in the report that had been altered by 1 letter. He told her about the truck and whose name was on the permit. He told her about the audio file that had existed for exactly 11 days before it was removed. He told her about the western shipping route, about the 3 warehouses, about the call placed at 4:15 in the morning, and he told her the name of the person who had signed the request. Then he fell silent. Amara sat perfectly still. She didn't ask a single question. She picked up the stack of papers, turned each page, and read slowly, the way she read everything, until she reached the final sheet. Then she set it down, and when she looked up, her eyes were dry. 3 winters, she said. Do you know what I did during those 3 winters? I called the transportation department. I called the hospital. I called the insurance company until they blocked my number. Everyone told me there was no record bearing my name. For a while, I believed I had remembered it wrong. I sat in this room and wondered whether I had imagined that there was a 3rd vehicle. Enzo said nothing. And now you're sitting here telling me it was there all along, with 1 letter wrong, and that the man who changed that letter sat at the same table with you. She folded her hands in her lap. Do you know what the worst part is? It isn't that. The worst part is that now I have to sit here and look at you, and I don't know why you came anymore. I came because you had the right to know. Are you sure? Her voice was very soft, but the question made him raise his eyes. Are you sure you came because I had the right to know? Or did you come because if you didn't tell me, you would have to live with it? He opened his mouth, then closed it. It was the first time in his life anyone had asked him a question for which he didn't already have an answer. I've been thinking about your sister, Amara continued. I thought about her all night. That girl didn't do anything wrong. I'm glad she lived. I'm still glad, even now, even knowing all of this. That is my equation, and I won't change it. She drew a breath. But your family wasn't separate from what happened. Your family picked up my name and buried it beneath a shipping route, while I was lying in a hospital learning how to transfer myself from a bed to a chair. Enzo placed both hands on the table. I'll make it right. With what? With anything I have. That is exactly the problem. Her voice still didn't rise. You have so much, and you're accustomed to using it to fix everything. But you can't fix this with anything you have. You can't buy back 3 winters. You can't buy back the night I sat here wondering whether I was losing my mind. She looked directly at him. And I don't want what you're planning to give me. You don't know what I'm planning to give you. Yes, I do. She spoke slowly, 1 word at a time. You don't owe me pity. And I don't want anyone to care for me only because I'm an old debt your family forgot to pay. Those words remained between them for a long time. Enzo didn't argue. He didn't explain, didn't apologize again, and didn't make another promise. He simply sat there for a while longer, then rose, picked up his coat, and walked toward the door. When he reached it, he stopped. He raised a hand toward the doorknob, then lowered it and turned back to look at her. "May I open the door?" Amara remained still. Then she gave the faintest nod. He opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him so gently that she barely heard the latch catch. It happened at opposite ends of the city on the same night. At the harbor, Bruno Tedesco didn't leave alone. He left with 4 men, and all 4 had once sat down to holiday meals in Enzo's home. The following morning, the warehouse on the western route was closed, and by noon, the lock on the rolling door had been replaced with one whose key was no longer in Enzo's pocket. 2 harbor contracts were withdrawn that same afternoon. There were no formal letters, only 2 brief calls from 2 men whose hands he had shaken at the beginning of the year. Nadia called him after the second one, and before she could finish her sentence, he told her he already knew. By late afternoon, the rumors had spread throughout the southern neighborhood, and people began to count. They counted how many people were still standing with him, and the number was smaller than anyone had imagined. At dusk, Enzo went down to the basement garage to get the car, and Sal was waiting for him there. Sal had driven for the family since Enzo was 19, had taken him to his driving test, and had sat silently outside the hospital for an entire night when Enzo's father died. He couldn't form a complete sentence. He merely held out the ring of keys with both hands and said that his wife was ill, that his eldest son had just had a baby, and that he didn't dare take the risk. Enzo accepted the keys. He didn't ask why. He thanked Sal for all those years, then spoke the name of Sal's eldest son and asked what the young man had named the baby. Sal answered, then turned away very quickly. Enzo stood alone in the basement garage with the keys in his hand. Then he opened the car door, sat in the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror, and did for the first time in his life what someone else had always done for him. That same night, at the other end of the city, Amara was seated at the dining table, putting her papers back in order, when Kiana came home. The girl didn't remove her coat. She stood in the middle of the room, and Amara looked up and knew immediately. "Amara," Kiana said, "I have to tell you something." She placed a sheet of paper folded into quarters on the table. It was wrinkled, its edges worn from being opened and folded again too many times. Amara unfolded it. It was a loan agreement, the kind printed on a standard form, with the interest rate written in smaller type than everything else. The signing date was from the summer. "I borrowed the money to pay the rent," Kiana said, and her voice began to break. "You went 3 months without receiving any transcription work, remember? You said you could manage. I knew you couldn't. I didn't want you to worry. I thought I could pay it all back by working extra shifts." "How long?" "Since summer." Amara looked at the paper. She read the line showing the interest rate, then read it again. Then she looked at the repayment term and performed the calculation in her head, the way she did with everything. And when she finished, her hand came to rest on the table. "How much have you paid?" Kiana didn't answer. "Kiana, only the interest." The girl burst into tears. "I'm sorry. I was afraid to tell you. I was afraid you would start looking for night work again, that you would stay awake until morning, and that you would be in pain again. I would rather borrow the money than let that happen." Amara said nothing. She raised a hand to her mouth. She thought about the day Kiana had left nursing school, the day the girl said she was taking only 1 semester off and would return, and how that semester had stretched all the way to the present. She thought about Kiana working 2 shifts, about the way she made coffee for both of them, and drank hers standing beside the sink so she wouldn't wake her sister. She thought about every morning she had pretended to be asleep. Then she thought about the one thing she had feared since the first day they wheeled her out of intensive care. The one thing she had promised herself she would never allow to happen, and she understood that it had happened a long time ago. It had happened slowly, 1 month at a time, while she was still too busy believing she was holding herself upright. Amara bowed her head. Her shoulders began to shake, and she covered her face with both hands. Kiana knelt beside the wheelchair and wrapped her arms around her sister, saying again and again that she was sorry. She was sorry. She was sorry. In the second-floor apartment that night, for the first time in 3 winters, Amara Whitfield wept. It happened in the middle of the morning on a weekday, when the children in the neighborhood were all at school, and most of the adults had gone to work. The electrical panel in the ground-floor hallway had been making a crackling sound for more than a year. 3 complaints had been filed. The first was sent in the previous spring, the second in the fall, and the third was signed by Verna Otley herself and carried directly to the management office. All 3 times, the same answer came back, stating that the matter was included in the comprehensive renovation plan and would be addressed along with the other work. That morning, the electrical panel stopped crackling. Amara smelled the smoke before she heard anything. She was seated at the dining table with her papers, and the smell crept through the gap beneath the door, the unmistakable odor of burning plastic. She didn't panic. She placed her hand against the door and felt it, then placed her hand on the doorknob and felt again. Warm, but not yet hot. She wheeled herself into the kitchen, filled the sink with water, soaked 2 bath towels and a thin blanket until they were dripping wet, then carried them back and packed them tightly beneath the door and along both sides. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had taught others how to do exactly this, and her hands didn't tremble. She called emergency dispatch, clearly gave the building number, the floor, and the situation, then added that there was one person on the 2nd floor who couldn't get down the stairs on her own. Then she went out onto the balcony. The wooden ramp outside the building had been dismantled the previous week, removed in accordance with the deadline printed on the yellow notice, and those uneven boards now lay stacked beside the building, waiting to be hauled away. Amara looked down at the street once, then stopped looking. Using both arms, she transferred herself from the wheelchair to the balcony floor and sat with her back against the railing, as low as she could because smoke always rose. She took her cream-colored sweater, the brightest thing within reach, tied it securely to the bars of the railing, and let it hang outside. Then she sat there, pulled a corner of the wet blanket over her nose and mouth, and waited. On the street below, the fire engines arrived after an amount of time no one would later remember precisely. Lines were stretched, barriers erected, and the crowd gathered at both ends of the street. Enzo arrived after the hoses had already been pulled to the main entrance. He got out of the car, walked straight toward the barrier, and a young firefighter raised one hand to stop him. "Sir, I need you to step back." Enzo gave his name. The man showed no reaction. Enzo repeated it a little louder, and the firefighter merely said the same words again, then turned away to attend to something else. Enzo stood there in the middle of a tightly packed crowd, and not one person gave him so much as half a step of room. No one recognized him. No one moved aside. Someone even struck his shoulder in passing without turning around. He looked up at the 2nd floor, at the cream-colored sleeve waving back and forth from the balcony railing, and realized that never in his life had he needed anything so desperately while it remained so completely beyond his reach. He had no one to call, no one to ask for help. There was no name he could speak in that place that would make any difference. On the 2nd floor, when the balcony door burst open and the first firefighter stepped outside, the first thing Amara did wasn't reach for his hand. She pulled a sheet of paper folded into quarters from inside her coat, the large hand-ruled sheet she had taken down from the activity room wall and brought home the previous week, to correct one line. "Call the incident commander for me," she said through the wet blanket. "Right now." The commander was summoned. When he reached the balcony, Amara unfolded the paper and held it with both hands to keep it from blowing away. "This is a list of the apartments where someone has difficulty moving around," she said. "The floor, the apartment number, and who lives with them. In the apartment below mine, there's an elderly woman confined to bed, and no one stays with her during the day. At the end of the row, there's an elderly man who walks with a cane and has poor hearing. He won't hear you if you knock. There are 2 more apartments on the 3rd floor. I've already circled them." The commander took the paper, skimmed it, then looked up at her. "Who made this?" "I did. Why didn't building management give us a copy?" "Because they don't have one," Amara said. They brought her down last, just as she had requested, after all 4 people whose names were circled on the paper had been taken safely out of the building. The building didn't collapse, but the authorities sealed it, and no one would be allowed inside to retrieve their belongings for at least a week. On the first night, the people from the community center opened the activity room and arranged several folding chairs along the wall. Amara slept there, in the same room where she taught first aid every Saturday morning, among the CPR training mannequins lined up beneath the wall and the space heater she repositioned with her own hands every week. Verna lay at the other end of the room. The elderly man with the cane from the last apartment lay near the door, and throughout the night, he kept waking to ask whether morning had come. Amara lay listening to those sounds and couldn't fall asleep until nearly dawn. When she opened her eyes, daylight had begun to fill the room, and a wool blanket covered her. It wasn't one of the community center's blankets. Those were made of thin gray fabric with numbers printed in the corners, and the entire stack was still untouched inside the cabinet. This one was thick, woven by hand, dark in color, and it carried the scent of someone's home, a faint fragrance she couldn't name. She remained still beneath it for a while. Then she asked Verna whether she had seen anyone come in during the night. The elderly woman said she had slept like the dead. Amara asked the woman who had watched the door. She said the door had been locked since 11 o'clock, and that she hadn't opened it for anyone. Amara folded the blanket, placed it over the back of a chair, and didn't question anyone else. Kiana arrived near noon, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small bag containing several things she had borrowed from a coworker. She sat beside her sister in silence for quite a while, then took out her phone and rested it on her lap. "Amara," she said, "I have something." "What is it?" "Mom's message." Amara's head came up sharply. "I've had it on my phone for a long time," Kiana said, her voice very quiet. "When Mom died, I was afraid you might lose your phone, or lose the number, or that something else might happen. So I copied it to my phone. I've never opened it. I only kept it." The girl looked up. "I know you haven't listened to it. I see the little dot on your screen whenever you show me something. 3 winters have passed, and that dot is still there." Amara sat perfectly still. "Listen to it now," Kiana said. "I'm here with you." Amara couldn't answer. She could only nod. Kiana pressed the button, then placed the phone in her sister's lap and took her hand. Delphine Whitfield's voice came through, weak and broken, pausing between sentences to draw breath. The voice from those final months that both sisters knew by heart. "My girl," she said, "I haven't been able to leave you anything. No house, no money. I know that. I've lain here trying to make the numbers work, but they never do." The sound of her drawing a breath followed. "But I'm leaving you this. Listen carefully." There was a stretch of silence. "Don't ever apologize for stopping that night. Do you hear me? I know you're apologizing inside. I know you lie there thinking you should have kept driving. Stop it. The day you feel ashamed of what you did is the day they truly take something from you. They've already taken your legs, and I can't get those back. But the other thing is yours to keep. Keep it for me." Then her voice grew softer. "I love you. I love both my girls." The message ended. No one in the room spoke. At the other end, Verna had turned her face away. Amara sat with the phone in her lap, and both hands resting over it. She listened again, then a third time. By the third time, she no longer heard the opening words. She only waited for the exact moment when her mother paused for breath and then spoke that sentence. That afternoon, Amara sat for a long time looking through the activity room window, watching the intersection where the elderly neighbor woman made her way across the street, one careful step at a time with her cane. That evening, she borrowed a pen and a sheet of paper and wrote a list. The following morning, she called Nadia Ferraro. Nadia answered on the second ring. "I heard the planning board is meeting about Crescent Row next week," Amara said. "That's right. Are residents allowed to register to speak?" There was a moment of silence on the other end. "Yes," Nadia replied. "Then put my name on the list." Amara began by knocking on doors. She spent both days of the weekend visiting every household that remained in the neighborhood, sitting on front steps or at kitchen tables, and asking the same question. Who had read the document to them on the day they signed? Most said they had read it themselves, but 3 families hadn't. All 3 had arrived in the country only a few years earlier, and their English was good enough for shopping and working, but not enough to understand a document more than 10 pages long. All 3 told the same story. An interpreter had been sent to them. He sat beside them, read the document aloud in their native language, and told them it was an application for relocation assistance, that signing it would give them priority for new housing, and that refusing to sign would place them at the bottom of the list. The mother in the 3rd-floor apartment clearly remembered him patting the document with his hand and saying that it was only a formality. Amara asked for the interpreter's name. They said they couldn't remember his last name, only what he was called, Terrence. She sat in silence on the steps of that home for a long time. She found him 2 days later in the parking lot behind the building where Hale's law firm had its office. He was opening his car door when he saw her at the end of the walkway, and he froze with one hand still resting on the roof. 3 winters had passed since the morning when he left a note on the kitchen table and walked away. He looked better than she had expected. "Amara, you work for them." It wasn't a question. He glanced around the parking lot. "I work as a freelance interpreter. I take work from whoever hires me. I'm not involved in the project." "The Estime family on the 3rd floor," she said. The Pierre-Louis family at the end of the row, and the Joseph family. You sat at the kitchen tables of all three families. You read the document to them. He didn't answer. You told them it was an application for assistance. You told them that if they didn't sign, they would be placed at the bottom of the list. She looked directly into his face. That document was a consent form for rezoning the land, Terrence. You knew what it was. You translated it into something else. He lowered his eyes. The hand still resting on the roof of the car slowly fell to his side. They gave me a prepared translation, he said. I only read what was there. Did that prepared translation include the sentence about being placed at the bottom of the list? Silence. Did anyone tell you to say that? He shook his head. Amara sat there with both hands resting in her lap, and she felt something very strange inside herself. It wasn't anger, but a calm emptiness, like the feeling of seeing the answer to an equation she had suspected for a long time. 3 winters ago, you wrote 11 words to me, she said. Do you know, I had never counted them until today. Terrence opened his mouth. Don't. She raised one hand. I didn't come here to hear that. I came to tell you something. She took a sheet of paper from her pocket, bearing 3 names and 3 apartment numbers, and placed it on the roof of the car, exactly where his hand had been. The planning board meets this Thursday. I can take this paper before them. I have 3 witnesses, and they're prepared to speak. His face turned pale. If I do that, you lose everything. You already know that. She continued slowly. But I'm giving you 1 day. From now until tomorrow morning. Go to the board clerk's office yourself and give a statement. Tell them who gave you the translation and who told you to add that sentence. If you go on your own, this will be the statement of a witness. If I take it before them, it will become the case file of a defendant. Terrence looked at the paper on the roof of the car. Why? He asked. After everything that happened, why are you still giving me 1 day? Amara placed her hands on the wheel rims. Because I don't need to see you fall, she said. I need those 3 families to get their signatures back. Those are 2 different things, and I only have the strength to do one. Then she turned her wheelchair and pushed toward the parking lot gate. He called her name once. She didn't stop. The planning board meeting room was more crowded than Amara had expected. Extra chairs had been placed along both walls, and people were still standing at the back. Preston Hale gave his presentation first, with a large screen behind him displaying renderings of a new neighborhood, with broad walkways, handrails, and elevators. He repeatedly used a phrase Amara would remember for a long time, calling it a community accessible to elderly residents and people with disabilities. When it was time for the residents to speak, the clerk called her name. Amara pushed her wheelchair into the center aisle, but about halfway to the front, her left wheel became firmly wedged in the groove of an anti-slip mat. The chair stopped abruptly. Everyone in the room looked at her. 2 people began to rise to help, and she raised one hand, not to refuse them, but only to ask for a few more seconds. She leaned to one side, rolled back half a turn, corrected her direction, then continued forward. It took her about 4 breaths to do it, and during those 4 breaths, no one in the room said a word. When she reached the microphone, she took her handwritten paper from her pocket. I'm not going to begin by speaking about myself, she said. First, I'm going to read the names. Then she began. The first household had moved away after 3 surprise inspections in 2 weeks. In the second, the husband's permit to repair cars from his home had been revoked after more than 10 years without anyone objecting. The third had been fined for the awning outside their door, though it had stood there since their grandfather's time. The fourth was a single mother who received notice that her child would be reassigned to another school district. She read each household, each name, and each reason in the steady voice of someone reading a medical chart. In the middle of the list, she stopped and said that the next person was sitting in the 2nd row. Verna Otley began to rise with the help of her cane. She was halfway to her feet when her hand began to tremble, and she looked toward the back of the room. Cal Renner stood there beside the door, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, watching her. The elderly woman sank back into her chair. Amara stopped in the middle of her sentence. She placed the paper on the microphone table, turned her wheelchair away from the podium, and pushed herself down the aisle until she reached the 2nd row. She held out her hand. Go ahead and speak, she said. I'm right here. Verna looked at that hand. Then she took it. She rose with her cane on one side and her other hand held in Amara's, and she managed to say 3 sentences. She said she had lived in that apartment since her husband was alive. She said she had signed 3 complaints about the electrical panel, and not one had received a response. She said that on the night of the fire, her child had been forced to leave work and rush home, and now had no paid leave remaining. Then she sat down, and the whole room could hear her breathing. Someone in the third row stood. Then another person. By the time the seventh person rose, the clerk had to ask everyone to speak one at a time and add their names to the list. Cal Renner pushed away from the wall and walked out. When Amara returned to the podium, Hale's attorney, a woman in a gray suit seated at the front table, had opened the file before her and removed a sheet of paper. Amara saw the movement. She knew what the document was. And she spoke first. Before the developer's attorney reads the paper in her hand, she said into the microphone, "I would like to read it myself." The woman looked up. "The Crescent Row consent file contains a signature bearing my name." The room fell utterly silent. "I signed it in the spring, several months ago. At the time, my mother was lying on the 4th floor of Mercy East Hospital, and she didn't have many days left. There was a pain medication that insurance wouldn't cover. I needed money, and someone knocked on my door during the very week I needed it most." She placed both hands on the microphone table. "Yes, I signed. I'm not standing here to claim that I'm innocent. I signed, I took the money, I bought the medicine for my mother, and I would make the same choice again if I had to." She raised her eyes to the board members. "But I'm standing here because I know exactly what a signature costs when someone is desperate. And that file contains many other signatures like mine. 3 families in the neighborhood signed without understanding what they were signing because someone was sent to read the document to them incorrectly. That person came forward and gave a statement to the board clerk's office this morning." Hale's attorney sprang to her feet and objected. In the last row, Preston Hale remained seated, loosening his tie with one hand. The chair struck the gavel twice and announced that the board would recess for 15 minutes. The bell signaling the end of the recess rang. Everyone returned to their seats, and the chair invited the developer's representative to come forward and answer questions. Preston Hale rose. He walked to the podium more slowly than he had before. He set down his papers, adjusted the microphone, and began his first sentence. He didn't finish it. He stopped halfway through. He raised one hand to loosen the knot of his tie, though it was already loose. Then he brought his other hand to his chest. Someone in the front row called his name. Hale staggered one step to the side, reached for the edge of the podium and missed, then collapsed onto the floor with his back against its base and his head tilted to one side. The entire room froze. A chair fell. Someone cried out. The attorney in the gray suit sprang to her feet and remained standing in place. The chair struck the gavel once, then stopped. 2 security guards ran to the door and halted there. The room was filled with people, yet no one stepped forward. The only person who moved was Amara. She was closer to the podium than anyone else. She pushed her wheels twice, reached the base of the podium, locked them, then placed one hand on the armrest and the other on the floor, and lowered herself out of the wheelchair using only the strength of her arms. She dragged herself about 1.5 feet across the wooden floor, turned, and positioned herself beside him. She called his name twice. She shook his shoulder. There was no response. She lowered her head, brought her cheek close to his mouth, and watched along the line of his chest, holding that position for the full length of time she always required her students to wait. Then she looked up. "Call emergency services," she said. "Someone call right now. Tell them cardiac arrest, board meeting room, 2nd floor." No one moved. "The woman in gray," Amara said. Your phone is already in your hand. Make the call." The attorney dialed. Amara placed the heel of one hand in the center of his chest, set her other hand on top, interlocked her fingers, locked her elbows, and positioned her shoulders directly above her hands. Then she began. She counted. She counted aloud, clearly, 1 compression at a time. In the same rhythm she counted every Saturday morning on the floor of the community center activity room. For a plumber, for 2 grocery store clerks, for an elderly woman with a cane, for a silver-haired man who had never given his name. She counted to the end of 1 cycle, then began another, and she didn't stop. No one in the room spoke again. All anyone could hear was her counting. Someone sat back down. Verna Otley rose, both hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her. At the rear of the room, the door opened, and Enzo Castellani stood there, but he didn't step forward either. He only watched, and no one looked at him. No one knew during which cycle Amara's hands began to tremble. Sweat ran down her temple. A man in the 4th row came forward and knelt beside her, said he had taken a class at work, and asked whether she needed him to take over. Amara nodded, finished counting her cycle, then said, "Switch," and he placed his hands exactly where hers had been. She moved back half a turn, breathed, and counted for him. Then she took over again. They continued alternating until the sound of running footsteps came from the hallway. The ambulance crew arrived, 2 paramedics pushed in a stretcher, and the one in front knelt across from her. "How long?" he asked. Amara was still counting. She finished the final compression of the cycle before looking up. 4 minutes, she said. He had 4 minutes, and I wouldn't allow myself to be the person who walked past. The paramedic looked at her for 1 second, then nodded and placed his hands where hers had been. Amara moved back. She sat on the wooden floor with both hands braced behind her. She couldn't lift herself back into the wheelchair, and she didn't think about trying. The paramedics worked around her. They raised the stretcher and hurried into the hallway, the sound of its wheels gradually fading. What remained in the room was the breathing of several dozen people. Then someone began to applaud, and another person said, "No, don't," and the applause stopped at once. Verna made her way down the aisle 1 step at a time, bent over, and placed a trembling hand on Amara's shoulder. Amara remained still. Her hands were still holding the same shape, her fingers locked together, and it took her a while to separate them. Preston Hale lived. People said that if help had come a little later, the outcome would have been different, but no one said exactly how much later, and Amara didn't ask. 3 days after the hearing, Enzo Castellani went alone to the board clerk's office and submitted a thick file. It contained every document from the Western transportation route 3 winters earlier. The archive log showing that the audio recording had been removed from the case file, the name of the law office that had submitted the request, and all 3 complaints about the electrical panel in the ground floor hallway at Crescent Row, complaints the management company had received and then placed in a drawer. He asked for no immunity. He signed the document, acknowledging that he could be summoned, and when the clerk asked whether his attorney was with him, he said she was waiting outside, but that today he wanted to sign for himself. The price came swiftly after that. The Castellani family's harbor transportation license was suspended pending investigation. 2 restaurants had to be sold within a season. The investigation still hasn't been closed, and every few months, Enzo has to sit through another round of questioning. Nadia Ferraro once told him that she had never seen anyone dismantle with his own hands what 3 generations of his family had built, and he merely replied that he wasn't dismantling anything. He was only returning something his family had mistakenly held for far too long. As for Amara, she returned to Odette's one quiet afternoon. Walter Kemp was wiping the counter, and when he looked up, the cloth stopped midway just as it had before. She told him that people had questioned her about his written statement, and that she had answered by saying he was the man who had poured her tea through more seasons than she could count, and that he had signed that paper while terrified of losing the last business he would ever have. She told him she wouldn't testify against him. Walter stood there for a long time, then sank onto the chair behind the counter and wept the way an old man weeps, without making a sound. The following day, he went in on his own and withdrew his statement. A year passed. The old building at Crescent Row was renovated, this time with an elevator and a proper ramp beginning at the edge of the sidewalk. It no longer belonged to anyone across the river. It belonged to a cooperative established by the residents themselves, with 1 vote for every household in meetings held on the first Thursday evening of each month. The ground floor was reserved for a community center, and simple words were placed on the glass door. The first 4 minutes. First aid was taught there 3 times a week, free of charge, and now there were no empty seats. Kiana had returned to nursing school and attended classes in the evening, and the old loan had been fully repaid by summer. Juliana Castellani taught music therapy twice a week in the room at the end of the hall, and when a student once asked why she had chosen to teach all the way out in that neighborhood, she only smiled and said it was because someone had once stopped for her when no one else did. In the center's lobby stood an old wheelchair with a cracked frame and a left wheel jammed in place. Beside it was a small sign bearing words Amara had written herself. "Don't judge anyone by what they're sitting in." On Tuesday mornings, Odette's still opened as it always had. Enzo sat at the counter with black coffee, no tie, and his watch face turned inward against his wrist. When the bell over the door rang, he didn't turn around. He simply pushed the second cup toward the table beside the window, and he no longer asked because it had been a long time since he needed to. Amara arrived, set down her bag, and they sat there together, the 2 of them, without saying very much. Outside the window, on the sidewalk, A boy who had just left his morning class passed by and saw an elderly man lower himself onto a bench. One hand braced against his knee because he felt dizzy. The boy didn't panic. He set down his school bag, knelt on one knee beside the man, and spoke the exact words he had been taught. "Stay here with me, sir. I'm calling someone right now." Then he waved toward the diner. The elderly man smiled and gently patted the boy's hand. From inside Odette's, Amara and Enzo watched together, and neither of them said a word. There are things we can learn from this story. A person's dignity isn't found in what they're sitting in, the clothes they're wearing, or the money in their pocket. It is found in whether they choose to stop or keep walking when someone needs them. Power only becomes meaningful on the day it accepts the cost of doing what is right. And the first 4 minutes of everything that happens in this life will always belong to the person brave enough to step forward, not to the most skilled person who arrives too late. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Amara, about Enzo, and about the people in that small neighborhood? Please leave a comment because we truly hope to hear the thoughts that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.